Do you want to know how you can connect with virtually anyone, from celebrities to the C-suite to high-level B2B decision makers? Then keep watching, because this episode is for you. Hello, Sales Nation, and welcome to today's episode of the Sales Man Podcast. On today's show, we have Phil Gerbyshak. He's a complete legend, and he is the Chief Digital Officer over at Vengreso. His course on social selling, on selling digitally, is available over at digitalsellingbootcamp.com. So if you're enjoying this episode, that is a link that you probably want to head over to. And on today's show, we're diving into the process, step by step, of uncovering the least friction platform to engage with someone, how to essentially get mentoring from them, ask great questions to them, and how you can turn that into a business conversation. And so, with all that said, let's jump straight in. Phil, welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Hey, what's up, Will? So great to be here, man. I love your show.
I appreciate that. That's a nice kind of intro, and I appreciate you tuning in. And Phil, on today's show, we're going to dive into connecting with virtually anyone. And this is kind of a big claim and a bold claim. And I think we're going to go deep in this one. I don't want the audience to think this is an easy process, but I think it is more doable than ever. But in the internet age, with barriers being broken down, with gatekeepers not being there, with multiple platforms to communicate with the decision makers, the influencers, the C-suite that we as B2B sales professionals are trying to get in front of, right now in 2017, is the trend of it being easier to get in front of these people, is that continuing, or is that perhaps shifting, or maybe even getting harder as we move forward in 2017 into 2018?
Well, I think it will continue to get hard. You know, it has to, because right now it is relatively easy. And I say relatively, it's easier than it used to be. Used to be you'd have 10 layers to get through. You know, they wouldn't answer their own phone. They didn't answer their own email. But now with smartphones, with social media, you know, it is a lot easier. And it isn't just about getting their information, right? It isn't just about, oh, yeah, I've got their email address. You know, oh, I bought a list. That doesn't matter. You know, now you really have to work hard and be honest and genuine about your connection needs and why you're hoping to help them.
So let me ask you another question on the back of that of, do we need to go deep with each of these connections and spend a lot of time and actually build a relationship? And obviously there's massively leading question here. Or are we spamming the heck out of the top 50 CEOs that we're trying to sell to until one of them just breaks and gives us some kind of reply?
Well, I think you definitely led me there. And the answer is, right, we do want to go deep. We do want to be genuine. We do want to develop a real connection. It's not about, hey, look, I shared one of your messages. So yes, let's connect on LinkedIn. And yes, now we can do business together. That's not how it works. You have to build a real relationship. You have to go deep. It is not enough just to connect on LinkedIn or just to, follow them on Twitter. It's never enough to just do anything.
And tell me if I'm wrong here, because I might be going mental, and I really appreciate my audience. I probably appreciate my audience connecting with me on LinkedIn more than a B2B decision maker appreciates a salesperson trying to connect with them on LinkedIn and share their content. Because clearly my business is based on the number of eyeballs that we get on the show. So when the audience shares it, they're doing me a favor. They're saving me kind of paid advertising costs, and it means a lot. So I think I'm safe in saying that I appreciate that more than a CEO who has 20 connections a day from people trying to sell him stuff that he may or may not value. Now, with that said, someone adds me on LinkedIn, I kind of click OK, and that's it. I don't really, unless they engage in a conversation with me, I don't typically email them. So is there any value in just connecting with someone on LinkedIn? Or, and because what I want to build up here eventually, Phil, hopefully, is a framework of what we should be doing, when we should be doing it, and maybe even who we should be doing it with. But is just sending a random connection request and then sending a message after the fact, is that the starting point of this process? Or do we need to get their attention and have them know, like, and trust us before we even send that connection in the first place?
Well, I don't think you have to do it before you send the connection. I don't think that, we have to go deep and then connect. I mean, a lot of times if you add a little bit of value, people will connect. It doesn't mean, though, that they know, like, and trust you. We have to be honest there. Just because they said yes doesn't mean yes to business. It's yes to the next step, that next piece of the conversation. Just like if they follow you on Twitter or you follow them, you can ignore every single message. that anybody sends. You still have to add value. You cannot just crank up the volume, be obnoxious, and expect that people are going to care.
I think you just touched on something brilliant here. And this might change the paradigm. This might immediately change how I thought about the whole conversation that we're going to have. And these questions have just gone out the window of, should we be aiming then to have the next step in the conversation to the point where the business just happens, versus what I feel like we're doing, and maybe this is somewhat selfish and maybe it's needed, I don't know, to be successful in sales. But I feel like rather than just aiming for that next bit of conversation, which is building that know, like, and trust, we're aiming for the zero-sum game of closing the deal, and everything else doesn't really matter. This just one point is what we're heading towards. Is that almost a counterintuitive way of looking at it, in that if we just look for the next conversation point, the business will happen, as opposed to kind of trying to reverse engineer this one moment where we heroically ask for the business and it comes in?
Yeah, well, there are no heroes anymore. In social selling, the heroic part is the people that don't spam. The heroic part is the people that continue to add value, that do make that conversational next step, that are willing to just converse with no ulterior motive. Because frankly, I am just as happy if I get some information that I didn't have about you, Will, than if I was able to close that business. And I say that not because I don't like closing business, because of course, right, I have to eat too. But what I mean is, if I get that next bit of information from you, that thing that's going to open up so that now when I talk to 10 CEOs, now, oh, okay, now I have something of value to add to them. And now when I have a conversation with the next one, now I can say, you know what, I was talking with another CEO and this is what they said. This is what they shared. So it's no longer just about me or my marketing team. Now it's about them and their peers. And it changes the conversation drastically.
Perfect. Okay, so let's build a bit of almost a case study or a real life example on this. Say I am selling some kind of SaaS software product and I want to get in front of a director of finance or kind of a CFO equivalent in the States over there. What is the first step for this? And tell me if I'm wrong here, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just to carry narrow the conversation and keep it moving forward, is it to suss out what platforms they're actually on and using, and then is that the starting point of this, or should we always go email first, for example?
Well, I think you should go in whatever way you can, whatever way has the least amount of friction. I mean, the goal is to work as less hard as you can in the beginning so you can work more hard at the back end. So if you notice that they're active on LinkedIn, that they're active on Twitter, they're active on Facebook, active on Instagram, wherever they're active, that should be your starting point. And your goal is to create conversation, not to gather email addresses. Because I've got plenty of email addresses in my CRM. Heck, I can buy an email address. That is not where it's at, right? That's where the connection on LinkedIn might start. Oh, yay, now I get their personal information. And that's great. But I should connect where they are most often, where they're active, even if they're not posting. I should be looking for things that are interesting. And then I should be working that so that I can move that closer to a conversation.
And again, get too practical about this, Phil, are we looking for, when you say perhaps they aren't posting but they're active, is there any triggers? Is there anything that we should be looking out for on the social profiles? Is there anything that we should be, and kind of wrapped up in this question, do we value the interactions on LinkedIn more than the interactions on Instagram? Because perhaps it's more appropriate to have a conversation on LinkedIn. How do we quantify all these potential numbers and data points so that we know where the best, I'm hesitating as I use this phrase, but the best kind of like location to attack is?
The best location to connect, again, is LinkedIn on Sales Navigator shows you who's been active. You can go in there, see if they're active. If they're active there, if you see that they're commenting, if they're liking, if they're sharing, if they're doing things, interact with them there. If you notice that their company is doing something that relates directly to their job, if it's a CFO and they just announced that they got $50 million in funding, well, now is an opportunity now for you to have a conversation with them about, so what are you doing with that? How did you get that? Asking genuine questions, not being a sneaky salesperson, but asking that. And then we look on Twitter. Again, if they're sharing content or they're at least interacting with it, look at what they're liking. Look at what they're retweeting. Look at even who they're following, because those people, even if they're not actually clicking like, they're still influencing their brain. So, okay, so maybe you interact with some of them so that you can say, well, I see you follow, Harvard Business Review. I was just having a conversation with Adam over at the Harvard Business Review about such and such a thing. This is where a conversation really helps you get to the point where you can actually connect, because you're like, oh, really? You had a conversation with someone that I'm already influenced by, thereby you are an influencer. That's typically how it works. And it's not that one is more or better or worse. It's which one is going to work. And it's hard to tell. I mean, the signal is really very faint. You have to really be paying attention, but that's where you have to pare down your list of people that you're listening to. Sales Navigator helps that. Twitter lists, on Instagram, setting up notifications on the right people that you want to, target. On Facebook, a lot of people have it set up so you can follow them even more than you can friend them, or at least you can check out their profile, because most people, they're somewhat public in their use of Facebook. Not completely, maybe, like I am, but at least somewhat. So maybe you have a friend of a friend. Well, okay, now we might have a pathway in.
So I had this somewhat, and this is brilliant because I think you've just done 15 levels deeper than previous guests we've had on the show, which is fantastic. And I had, as you described this, Phil, I had a similar experience recently with no one was selling me anything. It was just one of the audience members, perhaps just trying to get my attention or getting my good books to perhaps sell me something further down the line. But he dropped me an email saying, hey, I listened to this episode of the Tim Ferriss podcast. These are the kind of the points I took away from it. And I see that you enjoyed the episode as well. My mind at this point was like, how the heck did he know that I'd listened to that episode of the show? So I asked him, and he came back with that Tim Ferriss on LinkedIn had made a post saying, what guests would you like to see on the Tim Ferriss show moving forward? One of my audience members had linked one of my previous guests and said, really enjoyed this episode of the Salesman podcast with this guest. And then there was a conversation underneath it. And I put, yeah, I really enjoyed his episode on XYZ. And he'd already been on the Tim Ferriss show, just inadvertently. So I said, I really enjoyed that episode of him on the Tim Ferriss show, which is where I discovered him, had him on my show. So I realized I'm kind of going convoluted with this tale. But someone in the audience had gone through, seen these posts that I'd made, not engaged on LinkedIn and kind of got in that conversation, but then taken it to email with that information, whether they'd already listened to the show like they said they had, or whether they listened to have the contents to be able to drop me an email. But either way, they listened to the show, they pulled out some bullet points, and they were good reminders for me of what I wanted to take away from the show. And it was a good, interesting email full of insights of stuff that I'd already heard, but perhaps hearing it the second time, I can put it into practice. And that was a valuable email to me that didn't cost anything. Perhaps took a little bit of kind of bloodhounding and following the trail to work out an angle that was not totally obvious to me, so much so that I had to ask him why I did it, and how to describe it. I was almost, it wasn't shock, but I was set back by the effort that he'd put into it, and so much so that I'm talking about it on the podcast now, and he's going to listen to this and drop me another email saying, why didn't you mention my name and why don't you remember me? And so I'm going to be embarrassed about that. But is this what we should be doing, of going that level deeper than just liking a post or retweeting something and then expecting to have something back from that individual? Because it's almost value sucking at that point, just to share something and have expectations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That hit and run networking that we used to be able to do, people used to be surprised when other people on Twitter, really? You use Twitter, Will? Holy cow. Well, that's not the case anymore. Wow, you're on LinkedIn. Well, no kidding. So is everybody else. Microsoft bought them for $26 billion in 2016. I mean, this is not a surprise that people are on LinkedIn. So absolutely, go deeper, add more than the surface value. I mean, most of the time when I teach this, well, what happens is people make the easy out. They see the most recent thing that someone did and they use that for content. Well, everybody's doing that. Hey, wish somebody congratulations on their anniversary. LinkedIn has that as a trigger. Well, it's so bad now that people are asking, how can I make sure that I never get another anniversary note? Well, seriously, instead, I want you to go deeper. Instead, look at that. 7 years ago, here's how your business was. 7 years forward, now here's how it is. What's changed? And what insights have you learned, Will, as a result of having this Salesman podcast? Now, what number are you at? Like 130, 150, 500? I mean, come on, right? How much have you learned in the last 3 months, 3 years, 300 years that now you can share? And that would be something, because again, a senior executive, not that they necessarily want to directly mentor people that send them an email, but of course they want to share some insights. Of course, if you give them an insight, now they feel like they should give you an insight back. And if you ask a genuine, earnest question, they're going to answer you in a genuine, earnest way. But if they can tell that it's a leading question to figure out, right, if you're leading with the solution, well, now it's like, go away, you suck, right? Like that doesn't play.
So that you've kind of wrapped it up there, but I feel it's worth digging in deeper here, Phil. I was going to ask you whether we should lead with an insight and kind of hope that we get a response, or whether we should be asking questions. Because I've found personally that when you're dealing with these higher level decision makers, it's not everyone, but sometimes there's ego involved. Perhaps they're an extrovert. There's certain stereotypes that stereotypes are typically somewhat true for a reason, rightly or wrongly. So I find when I ask questions like this to individuals that I'm trying to mentor, is perhaps a strong word, but people I'm trying to get on the coattails of, people I'm trying to get under their wing a little bit, just because they're a good relationship to have in the future, not necessarily because I'm trying to sell them anything. I find that they do want to respond. They do want to give me insights. And is this how far do we go with this? And have you got any examples, perhaps, of questions that we should be asking, perhaps a CFO? I know it's context dependent, but just to give the audience, just to make it real for them, what kind of questions should we be asking a CFO of a marketing, a CFO of a company that makes a SaaS marketing tool? What kind of questions should we be asking them to engage in that conversation and start building this know, like, and trust?
Sure. Well, let me back that up first to should you offer an insight or ask a question? And my answer is you should be prepared to do both. Okay. You should always be prepared to do both. You should have an insight and you should have a question, because if they respond to the insight, then that's great. Then you don't necessarily have to ask a question that way. Now you can ask it when we're having a conversation. At the same time, if they respond with your question, then great. Then maybe you don't need an insight. But so some of the questions you could ask are, so what's different now that you're a $50 million company than when you're a $20 million company? What's the biggest surprise in raising money? SaaS software, right? Their whole goal is to get more perpetual revenue. Okay, well, how, they all know that marketing and sales should be aligned. You hear that over and over again. We focus on that at Vengreso a lot. Align marketing and sales. Well, you might want to ask, so how, as the CFO, how are you making sure that marketing and sales are aligned so that they can have a budget that makes sense together? That might be a question you might ask. You might see that, their biggest competitor just got funded and they didn't. Are they thinking about it, right? You could ask that question. A lot of times they might say, well, I can't tell you that. Well, that's okay, because they responded. Your goal, again, is not to close them, but just to get closer to the conversation so you can be a little bit friendlier. So asking those questions. The other things that you can ask, if you went to the same school, you can ask a question about the school. Did they have some particularly goofy professor? Especially, we know at college, a lot of professors have been there a long time. If we're close in age, it makes some sense, right? Is there a special place? Do they still go back for the homecoming game? Most alums do. So just ask some question. Doesn't always have to be value driven, but prepare an insight, prepare a question about business, prepare a couple personal questions, and see what works. It's not going to be one message. This is no silver bullet here, folks. To connect to virtually anybody, you have to over prepare for the conversation, because frankly, you don't know which one's going to hit. I can't promise you that question 7 is the right question for you. What I can promise you is that if you're persistent, if you don't give up, if you offer value, then they will see you as a person of value. And it takes time. These relationships, it's not a surprise anymore. Nobody is in a competitionless society anymore. Everybody has competition. So what's the competition doing? Maybe that's the insight. Hey, did you know, if I was going to pitch you, Will, hey, do you see that this podcast is doing that? Might you think of this? Or again, if I'm going to the CFO, hey, I notice that, this CFO at this company is doing X, you might want to try Y. Here's some thoughts, but again, that's depth. That's not surface level.
For sure. So I used to do this medical device sales of surgeons would use products in certain ways that perhaps we would describe them as off-label. So we would bring surgeons from one trust in the UK to another trust to give them an unofficial guide of how to perhaps they can use these. And this is how medical equipment is developed over the years of one surgeon will do this a different way. He'll use something upside down or she'll use something upside down. And then the manufacturer creates the product to allow them to do that. And that's how you kind of get like breakthroughs. So I would drag my favorite surgeons around. They would get a huge ego stroke out of it. The one in particular over here in Bradford, he's an absolute legend, but he didn't even love teaching. He just loved being right and making other men kind of like, because they're all 50, 40, 50, 60, all the consultants. He liked other grown ass men looking up to him from the different procedures and the way he would do things. So I used to drag him around all around Yorkshire and take him to different places to do exactly that. And it was nothing to do with me. I wasn't clever. There was no insights. There was none of my knowledge going in this. It was just having access to this individual who liked to have his ego stroked, and he was making a name for himself, and I was helping indirectly, I guess, grow his personal brand. So there's lots of angles for all of this. But Phil, before we get into what the perhaps step 3 is, if step 1 is sussing out where people are, step 2 is having a conversation started with them. But before we get into step 3, what happens when they don't reply to our incredibly insightful comments or kind of questions and shares and engagement? What happens when we just get ignored?
That happens a lot. It's not surprising. So now, okay, how else can you get connected? So who does that person know that might be able to make an introduction for you? How can you ride on the coattails of somebody who already has influence over them, right? Maybe it is your favorite author, right? Maybe you can get an autographed copy of the next book from someone. I can tell you, I send out tons of books. I'm fortunate that I know a lot of authors. So I'm going to get autographed copies of their books and I might send them out. Say, hey, you know what? Here's the latest book by so-and-so thought leader. I bet you don't have a copy of it. I'd love to talk to you about this book. Or, hey, you could even do a quick interview with them. You could do little 3 questions with pick an author. And now it's on your LinkedIn profile. Maybe it's on your blog, right? People ask, should all salespeople blog? Well, all salespeople should ask questions. So ask questions, use that as the basis. Again, show your path in through another person, right? Kind of go around the corner and then ride that in. And if they continue, remember, they're getting inundated with messages. So don't be afraid to pick up the telephone, call people. Don't be afraid to do that. Know that some executives still actually do answer their phone, but you still have to be just as interesting, just as interested, just as engaging, and you have to try again because there is no magic bullet, right? To connect to virtually anyone, you have to be persistent and you can't give up because who knows, right? They might not have seen them. Maybe on their LinkedIn profile, maybe it's an old Gmail address that they haven't checked in 3 years. Okay. Well, I get tons of people who send me email through my Facebook to connect. Guess what? My Facebook has an old Gmail address that the only thing I use it for is social media notifications. So once a week, I go through and I just delete everything that's in there. Well, if that's your path in and you're not actually connecting with me on Facebook, I never saw your message.
I love this idea of the authors and books because there's plenty of business authors that are, well, I know from doing the show and interviewing, they're way more accessible, even with million copies sold than what you think from kind of outside looking in of when I first started the podcast than what I thought they would be. And a lot of business authors, and I don't really read fiction, so it might be similar there. But with the nonfiction authors, they typically allow you to buy a book through their website, and for a little bit more, they'll sign it and they'll send it to you. So you could not have a relationship, customize that again, send it to you, you forward it on, and perhaps you don't want to kind of lie that you're best friends with the author, perhaps, but it could be a nice little treat for someone. And I have, people come on the show and when they've got books, they'll send me a copy of their book after the fact if I've not already it before. There'll be a nice little note in there. Stephen Covey Jr. sent me his book recently, and he'd put some little notes inside it, and he probably puts the same notes in all of them that goes out. It's probably a Sunday afternoon kind of activity of kind of an hour's worth of books and putting on the same post-it notes, same notes. But that felt like he made a real big effort for me. So again, taking a book, signed or not, and just putting a few kind of post-it notes in there of, I think you'd really like this. I know you're a busy person. You might not be able to read the whole thing. Is the goal of all this taking social media out of the equation for a second? And I know that's kind of a hot button and kind of a focus, a topic for yourself, Phil, but get rid of social media, pretend that doesn't exist. Is this all just about being different and breaking through the noise? Are we overcomplicating it perhaps and making it more complex than what it needs to be?
Of course we are. We're human beings. We always overcomplicate things. But yeah, it's all about being different, Will. It's all about breaking through the noise. It's all about not doing what other people do. One of my strategies is about connection, starting with happy birthday. Well, most people, right, if they see it on Facebook, they might write HBD. Well, that's no big deal. Who cares, right? So go from there. Okay, maybe they post on their wall. Maybe they send them a private message. Maybe they post on their own wall and tag them. Maybe they see it on LinkedIn. But instead, I want to encourage you, pick up the telephone and call them. Every day, I make phone calls to wish people a happy birthday with no ulterior motive. No ulterior motive at all. Just, hey, Will, it's your birthday today. Happy birthday. Hope it's a great one. Doing anything special? Most conversations are 30 seconds or less. Well, in that 30 seconds, that person knows that I care about them. They know that I recognize their birthday. And often I'm the only person who called them on their birthday besides maybe their mom. Well, now when I might call on them, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years later for business, now we have a relationship and they remember. I can tell you, I called someone last Friday. I wished them a happy birthday. I've been wishing this person a happy birthday for 11 years. They called me apologizing that they missed my call and how forward they were looking forward to talking to me on their birthday because I knew I would call. Well, think about that. Now, instead of just being a burden, now they're actually looking forward to my call. So when I do call back, even if they're in the middle of something, they might take my call. That's pretty cool. That's where we want to go. That's different. That's value add. And that is a relationship that will earn you money.
You just reminded me, Phil, of this may not be appropriate for all of the audience as a potential opportunity to break the ice here with a new potential customer. But I did this once for a surgeon. So Fiverr.com. Pay $5 or sometimes it's $10, whatever it is, and you can get people to do stuff for you. So one of the things, I had a surgeon, he's Welsh, a really proud, strong Welsh bloke, probably man's man. For his birthday, and this is a surgeon when I was in medical device sales, I sent him for $5, you can get a Welsh person to sing happy birthday in Welsh, and he names the person and does a bit of an intro before he sings, but he's wearing a thong. So I paid for this, sent it to this surgeon, and he's a rugby lad, kind of big, broad-shouldered. I had a decent relationship with him, so I knew he'd find it funny. I walk into theatres that afternoon after sending him in the morning. Considering it's cost me $5, what's that, like £4 or something like that? Absolutely nothing. And all the theatre staff are sat around his computer, probably 20 of them, all watching it on loop in hysterics. And he loved it, and obviously he shared it with everyone else in the theatre, in the operating room. And that, I became then the rep that sends these hilarious videos. And I only sent one of them. And I had all these other surgeons telling me their birth dates because they wanted something similar when it came across to them. I don't think I've told that tale on the podcast before. And it worked wonders. It's so simple. And there's obviously an element of risk to it. You've got to push your boundaries. And there's I think it's almost a perceived risk of not looking professional. But if you know the right person, if you've got a reasonable, it's almost, the risk was almost that he was going to accept it, but if you showed it to anyone else, it would make me look unprofessional. And I just don't think that's the case. I think we've got a lot more leeway with these kind of things than what we feel we have. And this probably goes down to asking questions, asking tough questions, asking controversial questions. And I guess this breaks through the noise. So with all that said, Phil, final step to this, and I'm conscious of time here, so this is probably a whole podcast on itself, but we've got to reply. They have, perhaps in the reply, they've referenced us. So perhaps they've been on our LinkedIn profile. They know a little bit about who we are. How do we, and again, another kind of loaded question here, and I know you're going to go with it. How do we transfer that from a conversation to a business conversation / sale further down the line? How do we progress from great, they've answered a question, kind of like whoopee, to we've closed 50 million in business with them?
Yeah, well, it's about the next step. So what is the next step? It should be getting them off of social media and getting them on the phone, getting a meeting in person. Could be getting a Zoom meeting, a Skype meeting, get somehow face to face and learn more. Gather enough information so that you can be super valuable, super specific, and super customized. Now, I hear what people are thinking. They're like, oh my gosh, dude, that takes so much time. That's so hard. Well, yeah, it is hard. And yeah, it does take time, but it's worth it if you're working on bigger things. If you're not going after that $500 sale, if you're going after something larger, if you're a B2B salesperson where your sales are complicated and there's multiple decision makers, if you can get one champion who can bring you in and show everybody how cool you are, well, now when you do go in, now you don't have to spend $1,000 on donuts, right? Now you can actually go in and now people are looking forward to seeing you. Holy cow. I mean, last year I got a thank you note from someone that I went and visited with a gift card thanking me for my time for doing a sales call. How does that happen? Well, I added tons of value in the conversation, right? This was a customer of mine that I poured value into, and they gave me a gift card. Well, it's all about value, folks. If you can add some value to people's lives over and over again and take it offline, right? Take it off of social and make it really hyper personal. Now you have more of their attention. And a lot of times they'll give you their cell number. They'll take your text. They'll enjoy videos from you. They'll let you come in and visit them. They'll take a phone call. They'll add you to their cell phone, not to ignore you, but to actually pay attention to. That's the next step. That's how you take it closer. And then you have all the information you need to determine, am I the best fit? Is my product or service the best fit, or is it somebody else? And then you have to be willing to refer that away because sometimes it isn't you. And then that makes you even more trusted. But you close the business because the relationship makes sense, because there's enough value exchanged that this is going to happen. You can't force people. You have to understand what their cycle is, right? When do they get funding? Who funds? How much do they have? Is this really a need? What's the priority? I mean, there's a lot more here. There's way more to sales than just, oh, relationship, yay, buy my crap, right? That's the thing. So we have to be aware of that. We have to know that it's going to take time. This is not a slam and wow, yay, close business. This is really a time-consuming, value-adding conversation as much as you can, as often as you can offline.
Love it. Makes total sense. And with that, Phil, I've got one final question, mate, to ask everyone that comes on the show. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Yeah. So if I was going to tell my younger self something, I'd say, first of all, you don't need to know as much as you think you do. So be more confident and say no to more people. Say no to more people. Not every job was a perfect fit for you, young Phil. You should remember that. So don't always say yes. Sometimes say no.
How do we develop this ability to say no? And I appreciate this is a whole podcast and a 4-hour course and a kind of a seminar in itself. But is there any techniques you use to develop it? Because it's something I'm working hard on at the moment with more and more opportunities coming towards me. My focus has always been just growing the show, and that leads to more opportunities. Just growing the audience has always led to more revenue, more opportunities, bigger guests, all this good stuff. And so how does someone like me or someone in sales who perhaps needs to turn down customers when they're not the perfect fit to spend time with better customers, how do we develop this almost like a muscle for saying no versus maybe, which is what I fall into a lot of the time?
Yeah, I do too. I'm certainly not perfect at this, but I think the best way that I've found is to think about my why. If I'm really clear on my why, and it doesn't say, heck yes, if I'm not ready to slam the phone down and yay, I'm going to do this. If that's not the answer, then I have to say no. And that means, though, that I have enough in the pipeline. I have enough in the funnel to say yes to. And that takes time. You have to get enough good yeses to know what a good no is. So take the time, practice that, and then ask unreasonably. There's this guy by the name of Jia Zhang. He's got rejection therapy. I encourage you to check out his stuff. Get used to people telling you no, making ridiculous, outrageous asks that maybe people say yes to, but get ready for them to say no to you, because that will say, oh, well, if they could say no, then I bet I could too.
Love it. I love it. And again, perhaps we'll have you on in the future to dive into some of this, because I feel like there's more of a conversation to had about it. I know there's the famous, I think it was the Stanford prison experiment, where they were actually in the prison where they were fake electrocuting people. And that came from an experiment of asking people to just, on the train, like, can I have your seat? And most people would say, yes, no worries. And then you'd have a policeman with you, and then everyone would say yes. And I think perhaps we don't feel like, perhaps we know, perhaps our guts are telling us that we've not added enough value to make these asks. And so that's why we are weirded out by no's, versus the fact that if we do everything right, they come more often. I don't know. There's a whole conversation there, Phil. But with that, mate, tell us a little bit about the digital selling bootcamp you got coming up, and where we can find out more about you as well.
Sure. So, well, Vengreso is the company that I'm in. We have a digital selling bootcamp, really focused on a lot of the social type tools. It's a 4-part series. It's $500 at digitalsellingbootcamp.com. And we've got all the stuff you need to take you to the next level of sales. So it's how to connect, how to find your right people, how to engage, all the important stuff that you need to do business in today's age. So it makes it really easy to take that next step. Because a lot of folks, they struggle with the tools. They struggle sometimes with the mindset. Sometimes they struggle, with just asking questions and being of value, and of even having a profile that's really customer focused. So we make that super simple. It's 4 parts. You come on. It's all virtual. So you sign in. We use GoToMeeting or Zoom, depending on when we're doing this. And it's recorded, so you can then take it. It's got homework. So it's got practical and tactical stuff, as well as some smart things that you can put in your head. Because often the reason that we fail as salespeople is not because our product or service is bad. It's not because the other person doesn't have an inclination to buy. It's because we don't have the right mindset. It's because we have commission breath. It's because, we're not confident in what we're selling, that we haven't added enough value. So those are the things that we teach in the Vengreso Social Selling Bootcamp. And you can get it at digitalsellingbootcamp.com. Just go there. It takes you right to the spot on the Vengreso website. Then if you want to know more about me, feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn. Gerbyshak is Gerbyshak. Just search for Gerbyshak. Look for me on LinkedIn. If you like Twitter, that's cool too. Facebook. I'm not super active on Instagram or Snapchat, but I'm there. But I encourage you, feel free to reach out. And then I'm going to give you one last way. For those of you that are really brave, call me. Pick up the phone and call. It's 414-640-7445. And I'll make sure that you have that, but put that in the notes. I want to encourage you folks, call or text. Don't be shy. Say that you heard me on the Salesman Podcast with Will Barron, and let me know, hey, how can I help you? I'll do my best to add value to your life so that we can work together, or not, that I can send you to somebody else that can help you even better than I can.
Love it. Sales Nation, take this as a challenge from me, that if you're kind of feeling like manning up and getting on with things and getting some free advice, and perhaps even, how do you even describe it? I wouldn't go, maybe you'd say different, but perhaps not, we go as deep as the word mentoring. But this is an opportunity here from Phil. If you just listen to him for an hour, for 37 minutes, if you enjoyed this show, go for it. It's almost a crazy opportunity not to. So I hugely appreciate that, Phil. We'll link to everything that we just mentioned in the show notes of this episode at salesmanpodcast.com. And with that, I want to thank you for your insights. I want to thank you for sharing with the audience. I've tried to kind of portray this as well, that social selling, however you want to define it, it's not necessarily easy. It can be somewhat defined as simple, but it works. And so I really enjoyed the fact that you kind of put that across in the episode. And with that, mate, I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks, Will. It was a good time.